Hey there, Leo. Thanks for coming on. For context, you are the dad of Eamon, probably
Okay.
my oldest friend,
Uh,
and we ran into each other for the first time in a while in October when I was in Maryland for a wedding, and yeah, it
mhm.
was super cool what you're up to. You sent me your book, your audio book. I checked them out, and so I wanted to hop on and talk about some of the stuff you're working on and some of the stuff you're into.
Yeah,
But
well, thanks so much for having me, Jake. I really appreciate being with you, and I appreciate your interest in what I'm doing.
yeah. All right, so let's just jump right in. I always say jump into the middle, and
Hmm.
then the with these podcasts, I try to figure out what are your values in the context of your story, and then once we kind of have established that, like what's important to you and why, then start talking about the future and the impact that you want to make, the impact that you're hoping to see others make, and some of that. But jumping right in, your book is about CAFOs and regenerative farming. Could you just start with the definition of what those things are and how they're related to each other?
Sure. Well, CAFOs are that's kind of the fancy term for a factory farm. I think the public would know it as a factory farm, and it's just a place where a lot of animals are concentrated in a very small space, and that creates all kinds of problems. It's done for the sake of efficiency, but that's a very debatable point of whether it makes things more efficient. It does in certain ways, but in other ways, it creates new problems. And so, our center has been dedicated to trying to get agriculture to phase those out. And I mean, there's lots of organizations working on this issue, but we are one of them. We come at it from the public health aspect of it, which is considerable because there's all these risks that are created by factory farms, things like antibiotic resistance in the animals. They use a lot of antibiotics in the animal feed, and that kind of hastens the process of microbes becoming resistant to medicines, including some human medicines. So it's a very concerning thing. So we work on that, and I've done some writing about that issue, but I also there's a point where you start searching for solutions. You don't want to just describe the problem forever. So what gets me excited currently is the regenerative agriculture movement, and I've always been interested in farming, which factory farms, people have said it's not really farming; it's a different animal entirely, so to speak. But I'm interested in farming, and regenerative farming is another term that's used as biological agriculture. I like that term too. They're both good terms. Because now we have an agriculture that focuses on chemical solutions whenever there's a problem, and I can get into what some of the issues are for farmers, but we tend to have chemical interventions to work on those problems like weeds or pests and things like that, or to increase fertility. But in regenerative, they're propping up the biology in the soil or regenerating the biology in the soil, which I think agriculture hasn't paid enough attention to what microbes in the soil do for us. It's kind of like a classic out of sight, out of mind story because microbes, of course, we need microscopes to see them, but it doesn't mean the fact that they're so small does not mean they're not very critically important for human health, for the success of crops, for all kinds of reasons. But you asked me about my values. Is that do you want me to go in that direction now?
No, we'll keep figuring out some context. I'll kind of dig in as they come up. But
Yeah.
so I'm interested when I had on my cousin Mike Fedison, and I know in your book you mentioned one of the stats. I forget the exact number, but it was something like there's 244 soil scientist graduates each year in the U.S. You were making the comment that there's a very few number. I don't know if 244 was the number, but it was somewhere in that order, I think. But
Mhm.
yeah, Mike Fedison was one of those 244, whatever it is, one year. But
Oh, that's
so
great.
we talked a little bit about it on that episode, and
Mhm.
um, but can you tell me from what you're working on, what does a healthy soil microbiome look like? What are you looking for? What kind of features are there? And then kind of the angle I want to take with that is like um, what kind of balance is struck in the diversity down there. But
Mhm.
yeah,
Well,
just
you hit on the word diversity. That is key to it being healthy, but it's also the amount of microbes you have because the more of them you have, the more work can get done in the soil, basically. But one of the key balances that you want is the balance between fungi and bacteria. And what happens in our modern agriculture, or in most agriculture, is that you till the land, and when you till it, the microbes that suffer the most are the fungi, because fungi are just like these long strands. I mean, the organism is made up of these long strands that kind of reach out into the soil, and they grab nutrients for plants. They transport water. They also a communication system. They transport like messengers, you could say, in the soil microbiome. So they do a lot of things that are important. But when you till, you really destroy a lot of that fungi, sometimes all of it. And when you lose those, of course, you lose all those benefits I was describing. And so one of the things in a regenerative farm, they want to um, monitor their soil for the microbial content. In industrial agriculture, when they do soil tests, they just look at what's the chemical content, like how much nitrogen, how much phosphorus, things like that. But they don't test for the biology, which is a, a big problem, because actually when you have a healthy biology in the soil, it's those microbes that go and get the nutrients for the plant. I mean, that's the way it's been for millions of years, even billions in the case of bacteria, because those microbes have enzymes that break down the physical structure of the soil. The sand and the silt, the pebbles, even rocks that have minerals in them that the plants need, and the plants can't access those on their own. They need some kind of help. And yes, we do use products, like external products, that have minerals in them, but they're not complete, and they're also not the best way for plants to acquire nutrients. It's much more efficient for them to get them through microbes. Um, so that's critical. So that that's part of the balance. So what happens is, let's say you and I went out tomorrow and we said, "Oh, I want to, dig up this corridor of land to put in whatever, some high tension wires or whatever." And of course, we need those. But when you do that, let's say you and I, we tilled that down to bare ground, right? Well, that bare ground would be dominated by bacteria, because, like I was saying, we would have destroyed the fungi, right? So in a bacterial dominated soil, that gives the advantage to something we don't like, which is weeds, right? Even though weeds do serve a purpose, they kind of like are the starter. You have this thing called ecological succession. You move from bare ground all the way up to a mature forest with lots of other phases in between. And as you move along that succession, you'll have a higher and higher fungal content in the soil. And at each of those steps in the ecological succession, a different kind of plant is going to be favored. So, for instance, I've read that in our agricultural soils, there can be five times as much bacteria as fungi when it's very degraded soil, and so we get a poor growing condition for, say, grains. Like, one of the main things we'd like to eat is wheat or corn or things like that, and those kind of crops, they prosper when it's a 1-to-1 ratio between fungi and bacteria. So in other words, 5 to 10 times what you would have in a weedy field, let's say, or a newly plowed field. So so it really doesn't make a lot of sense one of the things in regenerative agriculture, one of the principles is to avoid tillage, either entirely or as much as you possibly can. There are rare circumstances where tillage can be very helpful. Usually it's because you start with such a degraded soil that you need to break up some of the compaction in it. But in
What's
general,
the purpose of tillage? Like, just kind of getting into the value difference between factory farming. Like, if people are doing
yeah,
it, I'm assuming there's some advantage. But say, what are the pros and cons, and then how do you weigh them from
yeah.
your
The
scope?
advantage of the tillage is that it gives you a what they would call a clean seed bed. Like, you've gotten rid of all the irony is the tillage can get rid of weeds too. If you have a lot of weeds in the field at the end of a growing season, well, you can turn them under. Um, but it's ironic, because in doing so, you get rid of the weeds in the short term, but you also create the condition that weeds like.
Mhm.
And also, you sometimes stir up the weed seeds. There's always kind of dormant seeds in soil. We don't think about that often, but some people will call it the seed bank. There's lots of seeds that are kind of sitting around dormant, waiting for the right conditions to exist, where they will open up. I mean, a lot of things are temperature driven, but there's probably other factors that tell a seed, hey, it's time to wake up and germinate. So anyway, that can happen with weed seeds too. But yeah, I guess the biggest one would be the clean seed bed, and it just seems like it kind of fits into the whole idea of efficiency. We just tear it all down and start over again. But there's all these downsides to that, which I've discussed some of them, but we can get into that some more if you like. But
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of like if you take antibiotics, maybe if you're really sick, um, like you're saying, in certain situations, it might make sense to till the ground if you need to totally restart. But in
yeah,
most cases, for long-term health, if you can avoid it, it's best to try to slowly shift the biome to a healthier state.
yeah,
Um,
and I'll give you one example of when it can make sense to till, because one thing is not all tillage is created equal. There's plows that just make like a really narrow furrow as opposed to tilling up the entire field. And sometimes when you do that, let's say you have a fairly compacted soil, if you do that, what you can do is get kind of a twofer out of it. You break up some of the compaction with that. There's things like a chisel plow or a key line plow, they call them, that do this kind of plowing. And when you do that, you can add biology to the soil at the same time that you're doing this, breaking up the compaction. And then the biology that will spread. Once you get it, you sort of jumpstart the soil microbiome by injecting some microbes in there. And that's just with simple things like compost. Usually it would be compost that they would put in there, because compost is people in industrial agriculture would tell you that, well, compost, that's not very good fertilizer because it is low in NPK, which is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But the thing about it is it's a biological amendment to the soil. It's all those microbes you're putting in there, and they actually go and get those nutrients for the plants. So that's kind of what's missing from the analysis that you get sometimes from agribusiness or from the industrial ag world.
that kind of highlights what you're talking about earlier with the chemical view versus the biological view of the soil health. Um,
Yeah, it's certainly. I mean, this shift to. I mean, I like to say, like if I'm at my most optimistic, that we could actually move from a chemical age of agriculture that we've been in for the last almost a century to a biological age of agriculture where we solve all our problems with biology instead of using external inputs that are inorganic or chemical inputs.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
How do you test for um, the quality of the biology? Like you brought up the ratio of fungi to bacteria as saying optimal is somewhere near 1 to 1. But like I was actually wondering this for my own gut health. I was like, how would I test that? I assume it'd be like some of the characteristics would carry over to the soil health.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about this, but there are some labs now that will do that calculation for you. They'll just, by microscopic work, basically counting the bacteria and fungi and extrapolating to what it is per gram, or they use certain measures, but and then they compare that to what they think is an optimal level of those things. So yeah, there's labs that are out there now, and I think that will probably, if there are more farmers who shift to a regenerative model, then that should drive the demand for these kind of labs, because they'll be wanting that. Some farmers even are doing it themselves now. At least one farmer I learned about was looking through microscopes and looking at his soil and then making compost that would address his whatever deficiencies he found when he looks on the microscope, which is pretty cool. But
Yeah,
a lot of farmers won't want to do that themselves. They'll want a third party involved.
yeah, super cool. Um, I remember you always had that compost in your backyard. Eamon and I would go hunting for snakes and stuff in there.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah,
Yeah.
um, super cool. And so what are some of the features of regenerative farming that help maintain the soil health from a biological perspective?
Okay. Well, I mentioned no till, um, And it would be, like soil testing for biology is another good one. Another thing is creating diversity by crop mixtures. Like you don't have a monoculture in regenerative agriculture, because basically what happens is if you have the lack of diversity above ground, that will then be mirrored by a lack of diversity below ground. It's a strange phenomenon but the microbes in the soil, they can actually do kind of they can kind of take a poll of what's around them in the soil. They have what they do is chemical messaging, and so they can kind of get the lay of the land, like what's nearby, what are the other microbes or microbial communities that are nearby. And if they sense that the other microbial communities are very similar to them, then they will not collaborate with those other microbes, because they're kind of like in the same, they're occupying the same lane, if you will. They're competitors because they're trying to do the same job, right? And that's going to happen if you only have one crop. Say you've got one crop growing in a field, well, you're going to get one particular type of microbiome. Whereas if you get a lot of crops growing at once, their microbiome will be equally diverse, and also they will see the nearby microbiome as not a competitor, and they'll be able to collaborate. So there's a concept in which I'm not the best person to describe it, but in the bacterial world they call it quorum sensing, and quorum sensing is kind of like it's this idea of like finding out what's around you, but it's also what bacteria can do together. Like each species tends to have like a strong suit, something they do well. And if there's a job that needs doing that they can't do by themselves, they can collaborate with other across species even to do something, whatever that might be, like nutrient cycling, or, can be, I think, a lot of things. I don't know all the details of that. I just think it's fascinating, though, that there's a whole lot of collaboration going on in nature, that a lot of it is not well known. Of course, it would be among the people who are studying it, but studying the soil very closely. But that's just one example of how microbes collaborate, and that's to the benefit of plants too, because more gets done basically if there's a diverse soil microbiome.
Yeah, I remember when I had Mike on, he was talking about the how the roots kind of cater to different types of microbes, and so when you cycle the plants, just the roots that go in, they and he was even doing it more strategically, where like one year he would plant certain plants that would have root structures that would promote the next year's plan that he had, that he would set up the soil for the following year, with a biome which I thought was pretty cool.
He's literally a forward thinker. Then that's very
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
That's great. No, that's great. Yeah. And the other thing, I'm actually, I don't remember all the things. I'm actually working on a second book that's kind of a sequel to that one. So sometimes I forget which one I mentioned something in, but there's also this matter of perennial crops, which are they're in development and will have been for a while, but they offer a lot of promise, because a perennial plant has much deeper roots. It puts down deeper roots, for obvious reasons. It's going to be there for many years. You don't tear it up every year. And so the deeper roots means that you get to more nutrients, and you get more water. Like those kind of plants are going to be more resilient in the face of climate change. They are more resilient because they can get to more water in the soil, get to more nutrients, so they can survive droughts and other extreme weather conditions, heat waves, all kinds of stuff, really.
Does that also help with I forget the term, carbon? Is it sequestration?
Sequestration.
Yeah, the pulling carbon into the ground as deeper roots. You can.
It definitely does, because I mean, when you think about it, so if you're having a healthy soil microbiome, then by definition you're sequestering more carbon, because every one of those things, we're all carbon-based life forms, right? The same is true of microbes as humans. They have a lot of carbon in them. In fact, people talk about the soil organic matter a lot. You'll see even conventional farmers test for soil organic matter, I think, and 50% of the that organic matter is carbon. So, in general, it's generally thought to be about 50% carbon, right? So it makes sense that if you're making a more robust microbiome, more creatures, then you're gonna, by definition, you're gonna have more carbon in the soil, and that carbon can be in the form of things that are alive or things that are dead, and of course these microbes turn over very quickly, but a lot of that carbon gets sequestered even in the dead bodies. But then, it gets taken up, it gets cycled through other creatures, a lot of things. Some of it will get lost to the atmosphere, but a lot of it will be sequestered. And the other thing to point out in terms of carbon is a plant, when it does photosynthesis, it makes carbon compounds like carbohydrates, right? And it it uses a lot of those carbohydrates to build its own structure and for its own energy source or whatever. But it also puts about, some people say 20 to 30% of its carbohydrate into the soil to feed microbes. And the reason it does that is it has a symbiosis with those microbes, which goes back, as I mentioned earlier, millions, millions or billions of years. So when it does that, it gets something out of the deal. I mean, the symbiosis, of course, has to have, it's kind of like, hey, what's in it for me thing. So the microbes get that carbon because they can't do photosynthesis. So they get something they can't do themselves. But the plant gets all these minerals from the soil that it can't access all by itself. It needs those microbes to provide those, or to go get them, basically.
Yeah. Earlier, you brought up the idea of efficiency, and I guess I'm curious about maybe the discrepancy in your understanding with efficiency versus someone who's promoting a factory farm. Um, and
Yeah.
I guess one thing I'm wondering is like, by what you're promoting is tapping into these symbiotic relationships, where it seems like you help the plant helps the ground helps subsequent plants, and the ground that's the healthy soil goes deeper, um, and all that. So in some way, like the efforts of regenerative farming get multiplied through all these symbiotic relationships. Do you think that's a fair assessment of the efficiencies that you see in regenerative farming, and then how might that differ from someone who thinks they're being efficient starting a factory farm, and maybe they are in some ways but not in this particular way?
Well, I would say the thing about industrial agriculture in terms of efficiency, where it gets high marks is on labor efficiency. It's cutting down on the number of people involved, right? But at the expense of many other things where it's inefficient, right? Including energy use. There's a lot more energy use in industrial ag. Some of it is direct use, like tractors and such, but some of it is also the way the inputs are produced. The synthetic fertilizers and the pesticides. There's fossil fuel involved in their production also. And if they're tilling all the time, of course, they're making more passes over the field, so they're using more energy in that way. So it's very inefficient in terms of energy use. I haven't seen particular exact numbers. I'm sure they're probably out there on how a regenerative farm does in terms of energy use, but I imagine it would have to be. It's much more efficient on energy because it's not using those external inputs, and also you could say, well, one thing you don't want to do, you don't leave bare ground, right? In a regenerative farm, you don't ever leave the ground bare if you can help it. Because in a sense, when you leave the ground bare, it's like you're saying, well, I don't want all that solar energy that's going to land on these, whatever, 50 acres this spring or whenever. You're foregoing a lot of energy input, whatever, that comes from the sun, basically, if you don't have plants there. And also, when you don't have a plant growing there, the soil microbes either die or go dormant. So that's another negative to it.
Interesting. So what is this next book that you're working on? What's the thesis of that book?
Well, I did a deeper dive into the soil microbes and what their role is, what their function is, and it kind of played off. I spent several months doing a online course with something called the Soil Food Web School. And the way I found out about that school, there's a film I made called Growing Solutions. It's a 40-minute film about different solutions in agriculture to different issues like, water scarcity or fertility or improving soil, all these kind of issues. And when I made that film, one of the people I interviewed was a woman named Elaine Ingham. And Elaine Ingham is a soil ecologist, And she taught, one of the quotes she had actually when I interviewed her really stuck in my head, because she said, if you want to sequester more carbon, grow more fungi. And I thought, oh, I want to know more about that. And so I looked into that some, and then I looked into the fact she has a school. She's the one who runs the soil food web school. So I decided to take a course. Actually, it's 4 courses that are kind of a package deal, to kind of it's a primer on soil biology and some of the things I've been talking about here.
What does she mean exactly by grow more fungi? Does she like using your farmland if you have a farm to
So,
grow?
so yeah. So the way to do it is, well, one, you would try not to till. I guess that's the flip side of growing more fungi, is not destroy less fungi, you could say. But you can, let's say you're making a compost. To bring it back to compost, you can make the compost in such a way that you um, attract fungi, because fungi eat differently than bacteria do. So bacteria eat things that are like easy to break down. They don't have their enzymes aren't as good at breaking down complex molecules, right? Whereas fungi kind of they specialize in that. They're good at breaking down complex compounds, and they also build complex compounds. So you can put foods into the compost that will ensure that you get a compost product that's high in fungi. So if that's what you're looking for, more of that in your farmland, then you just want to create that kind of compost, or bring it in from an external source if you want to speed up the whole process. But so the thing to know about fungi is that they have a much higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than bacteria do. In fact, everything has a certain carbon to nitrogen ratio. Like for bacteria, it has 5 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, which sounds like, oh, that's a lot of carbon, but actually that's like less than, like, say humans have about 30 to 1 carbon to nitrogen. A lot of the green plants we eat are 30 to 1, but fungi can be as high as like 200 to 1 or even higher. Um, if you go into a forest, in fact, that's the place where you get the highest fungal to bacterial ratios in a mature forest. Um, but but so it's the case that if you're looking, it makes sense what she said, that if you want to sequester more carbon, you want to move your soil in the direction of more fungi. And you might not want, if you're growing, say, wheat or um, sorghum or barley or something like that, then you probably want to stay at like 1 to 1. I think those all kind of fall in that 1 to 1 ratio of fungal to bacterial. But that's still much better than what you get when you till. You're going to have much less, so you're gonna have a better fungal community, or a healthier fungal community, which will mean that you'll have more carbon sequestered. Before I forget too, I want to mention another thing, that we always talk about carbon sequestration in the soil, but another thing that a healthy soil sequesters is water, actually, because just like every living organism in the soil needs carbon, it also needs water, just like we do, right? And so if you have a lot of life in the soil, you're going to have more water that's contained there. And I was reading recently about how NASA referred to water vapor in the atmosphere as the most abundant greenhouse gas. There's more of it. It's a very potent greenhouse gas, actually. Now, it doesn't stay in the atmosphere as long, but still, it's sequestered a lot of heat. And the thing about it is, it's one of the things that was kind of predicted about climate change, is that there would be more moisture in the air, and that you have these big weather events like giant rainstorms. Well, that's because in general there's more water vapor around. There's more water to feed these systems, these storm systems, right? Now, we've lost a lot of carbon from soil. People will say, even in the industrial uh, world, they'll say we've lost a lot of our carbon from our soil, or they'll say they lost a lot of soil organic matter. But that's, as I mentioned, that's sort of a proxy for carbon, you could say. So we've lost all that carbon, but in the process of losing that carbon, we also lost water retention capacity, right? And so that's one of the things that people find when they improve their soil, that their water retention is better. But strangely, at the same time, your water infiltration rate is also better. So what happens is, people talk about the soil in some circles. They refer to the soil sponge, and when you think about a sponge, it collects water and collects water. It keeps on doing that until it gets full, But when it's full, it doesn't. There's not a puddle that forms on top of it. It kind of just drains out the bottom, right? And that's kind of how a healthy soil operates. It's very good at retaining water until it can't retain it anymore, but then it sheds it into the groundwater. Whereas if you had an unhealthy soil, it will tend to be compacted, and then you'll have puddling on the surface. A lot of farmland. You'll see that in these some of the times when in the Midwest they've had really terrible storms. These more unhealthy looking farmland areas, they'll have lots of puddles on top. Well, if your soil is really healthy, it won't do that. It will infiltrate water very quickly. In fact, there's a guy I interviewed for that film, Growing Solutions. This guy Gabe Brown. He's a rancher in North Dakota, and he had people from the Federal Natural Resources Conservation Service, is part of USDA. They came out to his farm and they measured the infiltration rate on his farm, and they found that his soil could infiltrate an inch of rain in 9 seconds and 2 inches in 25 seconds, which is more rain than he's ever probably going to experience. But it's also much better than his neighbors on their land. So that's a significant feature in trying to be resilient against climate change, things like that, where healthy soil is great at, again, both carbon sequestration and water sequestration.
Do you know, like, functionally what that sponge feature is that's missing in, um, like I've been in Washington the last few years. I'm in Tennessee now, and in Washington it rains a lot, but I've noticed that it's never muddy. The water always just gets absorbed. It almost, however hard it rains, the puddles don't form, except for in the super low areas.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's all old growth forest, and based
Yeah.
on what we're talking here, I'm imagining there's a lot of fungi. I'm imagining there's
Mm-hmm.
a diverse microbiome down there. Um, I guess so. Over here in Tennessee, I'm in an apartment, and I think this whole complex was made in uh, 20 years ago or 15 years ago. And there's the place where I walk the dogs. It's not an old growth forest. You can see the trees aren't that old, and it doesn't drain that fast.
Yeah.
When it rains, it stays puddle. There's puddles, and it's muddy for days. Um,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
so
Not surprising.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, anytime you have disturbed ground, you're going to see that there's less,
yeah,
infiltration. Well, because it will be compacted. A disturbed ground is going to tend to be a very compacted ground, right?
right,
Heavy machinery was on it, probably.
yeah,
So once you do that, once you compact the soil, you're not going to get. First of all, there won't be as many plants growing there to suck up the moisture, and then also it'll just be sometimes a hard pan on top, or just a very compacted soil water can't get through. And so all those microbes are actually the thing. This is the thing that seems the most mundane about what microbes do, but it's incredibly important. They create the structure of the soil. Bacteria. It's a strange thing is, so bacteria, they're really tiny, right? You can't see them without a strong microscope, and they're so tiny that they're going to just wash away in a rainstorm, right? If they were just out there in the soil solution or whatever, they'd be gone with the next first irrigation event or rainstorm. So what they do for survival is attach themselves to pieces of organic matter or something in the soil that's going to stay there, something bigger than them. And they are able to do that because they make these glues, like bacteria will make glues. Like, how sometimes something's slimy, if there's bacteria on it, it's slimy. Well, that's actually a glue that you're feeling. It's there's part of their survival mechanism, you could say, right? So the bacteria make those glues, and what they do is by doing that, they attach themselves to a lot of organic matter, and it kind of like then tends to collect into what they call microaggregates, right? So they've got these little whatever grains in the soil that are they're not like perfectly round. They have lots of texture to them. So that means there's lots of air spaces around it, right? But then it gets even better because the fungi will kind of corral those microaggregates together and make bigger aggregates that they call macroaggregates. So if you look in a farmer who has a really healthy soil and they lift up some of that soil and show it to you, you'll see these. You'll actually be able to see the macroaggregates. I will say, not to toot my horn, but I see them sometimes in my own garden or in my compost pile, those macroaggregates, right? And so those really make it easy for water to penetrate because they create all these pore spaces, like pore spaces, that it allows water to penetrate, it allows air to penetrate, which is important because you want to feed those aerobic microbes. The oxygen loving microbes are the ones that do all the beneficial stuff, right? So you want air to be able to get in. And then, of course, roots are able to get down into the soil once you create those pore spaces. Otherwise, compacted soil, they can't. You don't see deep root systems in a compacted soil because plants can only generate a certain amount of pounds per square inch of pressure. And after that, what you'll see actually, you'll notice, you ever see like you see a tree in the city and its roots are above the ground. It's like running right along right? You see it all the
Yeah.
time, right? Well, that's not really the way a tree would normally want to grow its roots. But in a city, whereas things are very disturbed, soil's disturbed, it can't go down as deep as it would like to because there's a compaction layer wherever it was, whatever happened there, heavy machinery was on there or whatever it was. So they can't go any deeper. So then they'll go sideways, and it's just doing the best they can do under the circumstance. So, but you don't see that. You'll notice, like in a forest, you're not going to see that. You might see it near the trail because, of course, we're compacting the soil when we're hiking along the trail or whatever. But you don't usually see roots that are above ground, like in the parts of the forest that are undisturbed. At least that's what I'm noticing so far. So
Yeah, that checks out with
yeah,
my observations too. So here in where the ground is compacted and it gets muddy, if that was left undisturbed for years, the the microbes in the soil would grow. They would start to aggregate, and then that would create pores, which would allow more plants to grow and their roots to go deeper, and it would just kind of become a cycle that would
yeah.
slowly. Okay.
One thing I would say, though, I mean, that's definitely what you're describing is the kind of process that can happen. One thing I would say, though, is, and here's where I would say that like human intervention can be actually a really good thing because a lot of our interventions in agriculture are negative, and so it can give the impression like, oh, humans should just leave it alone, leave nature alone. But I think it's okay when we're doing interventions. It's okay if we're mimicking what nature does, and that's a lot of. And so the reason I say this, so if the place you're describing that has a very compacted soil, if you take away all the fungi, let's say there's no fungi in there, well, it's kind of hard for them to start up from nothing. Kind of you might need to, or at least to speed it up. It might take forever for just whatever fungal spores to arrive there from wherever, and I don't know exactly how long that would take, but it could be a very slow process. So if you're trying to speed it up a little, then you would put something like compost on there. Like you make a good compost that will inject all those good microbes in there. And then that will happen much more rapidly. Because once they get going, it's going to be, just a natural process at that point. Once you get the thing started, I kind of think of it as the analogy for me is, if we just said to ourselves, "Oh, I want there to be wolves in Yosemite National Park again." Oh, okay, let's just sit back and let them, start up here. It's like, okay, but don't we need to first find some and have the first seed the place, if you will, with some wolves. Otherwise, we'd be waiting a very long time for them to travel, from some other park or wherever.
Yeah, I love that wolf metaphor. And that I'll just add a little color just since I just read it in a book. But that's interesting because the scenario there is, and you can jump in. I probably have a more general understanding than you, but in Yellowstone, the wolves had died out or they'd been killed, and it was a missing part of their ecosystem, which had kind of been built with the wolves there. And so the rest of the ecosystem started to suffer, and eventually people realized, oh, the wolves are missing, and therefore the animals that they hunt are growing in population, and the whole balance that's been established is getting thrown
Yeah.
off. So they reintroduced the wolves, and then in like a matter of a year or two, everything kind of went back to normal. Right? It was remarkably fast for that. That's the version I remember.
Yeah, I mean that sounds great. I mean that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Like our interventions can be a good
Yeah.
thing. I haven't read a lot about this. I want to read about it, but a lot of people have been mentioning beavers lately too. I think there's a couple of recent books how they're so crucial to water resources. Like what they do in damming up rivers is actually incredibly helpful to an ecosystem. So anyway, that's also fascinating. But I think it's like the reason you remind me of them is I think it happens fairly quickly, just like with
Yeah.
what you described with the wolves. So
I I heard another anecdote, and this one I have a less specific understanding of, but there was somewhere in Europe, I think, that they were going to put in dams to control the flow of water. And then they had this whole plan. It was going to cost $150 million or something. And then the beavers just did it. And they put the dams almost at the exact places that the humans had spent all this time researching, because the beavers just kind of naturally knew where the
That's
water collects. So it's,
that's really funny.
yeah. All right. So one thing I want to jump in a little bit, and I think this kind of will help define the values that you see in this. But where is the line with human intervention? You mentioned that if you're mimicking what nature does,
Hmm.
um, so let's say you hear about a new farming process that someone has established. What types of features are you looking for to see if that's a nature like intervention, or if that's
Hmm.
um, a,
Well,
yeah, or if
it
it's
might be
not.
best just to give you an example of,
Yeah.
again, this is like I'm playing off the film, the Growing Solutions film, but there's a guy named Wes Jackson who started something called the Land Institute in Kansas in 1976. And Wes Jackson, I remember him saying that people talk about problems in agriculture, but they don't talk about the problem of agriculture, how agriculture creates all these problems. And he says that basically agriculture took a wrong turn when it decided, whatever, 10,000 years ago, when humans decided to stress annual crops instead of perennial crops, right? Because that meant that we were going to plow the ground, right? If we're going to do annual crops, going back to what you were asking before, like what's the advantage of tilling? Well, an annual crop, you have to seed it every year, and it has, if you don't plow the ground, then it's competing with all these other plant species, so he said that the way to what he started doing was seeing the prairie as nature's model, kind of how it should be done, really. And he said he took his students on a trip to a thing called the Kanza Prairie, and they noted that there were no external inputs. I mean, it was a very lush ecosystem, the prairie, and it was no fertilizers, external fertilizers, no pesticides, none of that. And yet it was thriving. And also, he noted that it's mixtures of plants. So that's the nature's model: is no inputs, and have it be mixtures of plants together, because that create, again, like I said earlier, that creates diversity within the soil. The thing you didn't mention was the soil microbes, and that diversity above ground again is mirrored below ground. So all that to say, that's the model. And what we do in industrial agriculture is the opposite. We stress annual crops in monocultures, and all that kind of mitigates toward having a less healthy microbiome for the reasons I think we've gone over. So that would be like a way to say, oh, okay, that's mimicking. If you're looking at a model, it's like, does this mimic nature? And then you can ask the question. Well, nature doesn't plow either. These are all things nature
Yeah.
doesn't do. I mean, when you go in that mature forest, Jake, in Washington State, you can ask yourself, who's fertilizing it? Who's putting the fertilizer down? Nobody, right? Who's spraying pesticide? I hope. Well, sometimes they might for some, but hopefully they're not. And then, the other thing, what was the third? Oh, tilling. Nobody's tilling the land there. And these things are putting down incredibly deep roots. And usually, if there is some kind of pest infestation, it's a sign of some kind of imbalance, a lack of diversity. So, as opposed to the forest isn't crying out for a chemical to solve that problem, it's showing that there's some imbalance, which is beyond my pay grade to figure out what that imbalance is. But we do have people who know how to figure that out. So,
That's cool. You mentioned a couple times your movie, Growing Solutions. Where can people find that?
yeah, so that's on YouTube. It's freely available on YouTube. Uh, I think if you just Google Growing Solutions,
Okay,
yeah, I don't think you'd even need my name, but maybe you could throw my name in there to make it easier. But
cool. I'll find that and put a link everywhere
yeah,
this
that'd be great. And so
is
it's like
posted.
about a 40-minute film, so it
Yeah,
doesn't take up too much of your time. So,
yeah,
and I think it introduces a lot of topics, a lot of things we've been talking about. So,
cool. Last thing I kind of want to get into is what are some of the barriers to shifting to more of a regenerative approach?
hmm
You talk about it a little bit in your book that I read. But yeah, so there's financial, there's um, systematic, but yeah, what needs to change
Mm-hmm.
on a macro scale? Do you think for people to move more in that direction? Is it education? Is it
Yeah.
money?
So it's it's multifaceted, but as you alluded to, um, the first thing I would say is I always say that there's always a constituency for the status quo, right? We have a status quo in agriculture. It got that way for a reason. For one thing, somebody's making a lot of money off all these inputs, right? Um, and farmers. I don't really blame farmers for doing things the way they do them because they're being told from all these different angles that this is the only way to do it, and so I can't blame them. They're inside a system that is hard to it's hard to just tweak it a little bit. It's kind of like a package deal. Like you do it all, you don't do it. And it's difficult to transition. I don't fault somebody for saying, well, I could make this transition. I see the logic of it, but it's going to cost me more than I can afford, or I can't afford to have a couple down years while I'm waiting for this thing to take hold. And it doesn't take the biological shifting to the biological approach doesn't really take a long time, like 2 3 years, but that might be a deal breaker for some people. Although the thing to do, really, a lot of farmers will start out, if they're skeptical, they'll just do, let's say they have 1,000 acres, they'll do like 20 acres with some new methods, right? And then see how it goes. And then, that can be the thing and make them say, oh yeah, this is for real. In fact, that's the Soil Food Web School, and Elaine Ingham I mentioned, she works with a lot of farmers, and not just her, but all these people she's trained. They do kind of consulting with farmers, and that's the model you see over and over again. The way farmers shift is that they get into a crisis stage. I mean, it's kind of like this is how we behave as humans, right? Sometimes we're not moved to action until there's a crisis. I mean, I can't say how many different. So, so they have some down years and they're like, this isn't working for us anymore. We're not making enough money in this industrial model. And so they try, again, they try it as a pilot project, really. They try biological methods on some of their fields. And then, over and over, they see that there's, real promise in it. And so then they eventually convert their entire operation to the regenerative model. And that applies, I should mention, that it applies to like pasture animal agriculture, farmers who have their animals out on pasture, because if you revive the soil microbiome, it also helps grasses thrive more, and so there's more. That's just more food for pasturing animals. So some of the ranches have great stories, great testimonials about how their pastures were improved. In fact, a lot of them in Australia, they've had clients all over the world. Actually, the Soil Food Web Incorporated, it's called. So they have the school, but they do consulting work under the name Soil Food Web Incorporated, and they, like I say, they have clients in Africa, in Europe, in Australia, all over.
It's super cool.
So yeah,
There's this term anti-fragile. I'm not sure if you've heard it. I originally heard it in like a
sure.
economic sense. It was an investment strategy, but the idea is that an anti-fragile system, when exposed to stress, gets stronger.
Mm.
It breaks down a little bit and then it responds by getting stronger,
Mm-hmm.
which is it's like it's different than robust. So if there's a robust building or something, if there's an earthquake, it
Mm.
might stay there, but it's not going to get stronger. Whereas the human is a anti-fragile system. I'm a I'm a trainer, so if you go do your squats, it breaks down your quad muscles a little bit, but they rebound by getting a
Mm.
little stronger than they were before you did the squats. Um, so the question I asked you a little earlier on how, like, where you find the line between a nature-based system and a, a non-regenerative system, um, that's that's kind of this is bringing up the idea of anti-fragility to me, where
Mm-hmm.
these regenerative farms, they're compounding their own success. They get a little better, the soil gets better, the next year is even better, and it just kind of grows as an anti-fragile system does.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think I have actually come across that term, but I'm not real familiar with it. But it might have been in the context of there's a long-running experiment in Germany called the Jena experiment. I believe it's pronounced as Jena, but it's pronounced the Jena experiment, and it's an ecological experiment where they test. They have test farm plots, and they're basically looking at this issue of diversity in the soil and what it does for crop outcomes, you know. But it was interesting. One thing this was sort of, it just happened by accident that they had really terrible storms one year, and some of the plots all got flooded basically. Even the ones that were more whatever regenerative or whatever, more diverse, or whatever. But the ones that were more diverse, even though they also got flooded, they rebounded better than the other ones. I mean, in fact, almost everything died in some of the plots, I think. But it was like the more diversity they had in a plot, the more successful it was, or more resilient it was. So that was very interesting.
I
Um,
know fires too are an example. When there's a healthy, when there's a fire in a healthy forest, it often rebounds and becomes even more lush in subsequent years.
yeah,
Heard that one
yeah.
too.
I know it's been part of the way forests have evolved, right, with fire
Yeah,
actually. So yeah, yeah. No, it all kind of relates, and sometimes it's the microbes doing a lot of that, and they don't really get the credit. I feel like lately I'm a PR person for microbes because you hear things mentioned in agriculture a lot where it's like, oh, I know that microbes are part of that, but they don't say anything about it. Like they'll
yeah,
say things like, oh, they'll measure, say, macro aggregates in the soil. Like they actually, some people, even I think conventional farmers, will measure their, I think they call them stable aggregates or whatever. But they never mention that it's microbes that make those aggregates, like I was
mhm,
discussing earlier. So it's just kind of weird. It's like, okay, you don't have to mention, but it would be nice for public education if you would like throw in a plug for the microbes,
yeah,
because people don't really understand how important their role is. And you mentioned, I haven't read up a lot on this, but the gut microbiome, the human microbiome, is crucial to so many things.
yeah.
We really couldn't exist without them. It's not like they're just beneficial. They're actually, I think that's even underselling them. They're critical to our survival. And actually, the thing I forgot to say about soil microbes and they create that structure. Well, if you don't have soil microbes, then you basically don't have soil. You have dirt, and because in order to have a soil, it has to have biology in it. Soil is biological, so that means microbes. I mean, it has bigger things in there too, the earthworms and everything. But the foundation of it all is those microscopic creatures that do so much work that goes, unseen for most of us.
Yeah, it's you're like the Lorax for the microbes. I speak for
Yeah,
the
yeah,
trees, for the trees have no tongue.
yeah. There you go. Yeah. I have standing.
Yeah, I think that I'm hoping that the next wave is the microbes. I mean, I'm more focused on the health than I am the farming, but I think there's a ton of overlap there with
Oh, most definitely.
just yeah, that's the lens I see everything through, and more I see trainers that are kind of ahead of the curve,
Yeah.
suggesting microbiome type strategies and
Yeah.
stuff like that. So I hope this wave is coming. The last question I have for you is, what are you hoping to accomplish over um, the next few years, and then what would you love to see people in Amen and my generation accomplish? So kind of like, what are your yeah,
Mhm.
what do you hope to see in the future, both short
Well,
and
I'm
more
at a
distant?
school. I'm sorry.
Just yeah, it's over the next few years and then into the distance. What are you hoping the shifts occur?
Yeah. Well, I'm at a school of public health, so I'm at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and I work for something called the Center for Livable Future. But we're also kind of the Center for Sustainable Food, you could say. So because I'm at a school, though, of course, my focus has a lot of it has been on education, and I like to kind of get the word out to the whole public, whoever's interested, kind of, Um, and so that's why I wanted to write these books, and also. Um, a lot of what's happening is, I'm not plugged into it entirely because I'm not a farmer, but there are farmers out there who are doing incredibly interesting things. And a lot of them are doing it at scale, if you will. They have really large farms. I used to have a bias against large farms because they seem to always be the ones that were doing the worst things, but it doesn't have to be that way. There's been In fact, the guy I mentioned, Gabe Brown in North Dakota, he has like 5 or 6 thousand acres. It's not like he's got a little hobby farm. It's like he's a large scale farmer, and he's become an icon of regenerative agriculture, even though he used to farm conventionally. But when you think about it, we didn't have any farmers who were, taking up that label of regenerative before. Now we're starting to see them. I mean, I look forward to the day when there's so many of them. It's like, you can't name them. You don't know them by name because they're just all out, so many of them out there. But the thing about it is you have to, you're going to need everything to make the shift. I mean, you got to have farmers making those shifts, but you also have to have consumers knowing why it's important. You're going to see more and more of the regenerative label, I hope. I mean, you see organic on products, which is good, but regenerative, I think, even goes farther in terms of fostering the environment, the agroecology, if you will. And so hopefully you'll see more of those labels on things, and hopefully consumers will learn more and more about why that's significant, why they should support those kinds of farms. Because of course, if we don't support those farmers, they're not going to be able to thrive, obviously. So
That sounds like a good thing that anyone can do, even if you're not educating or farming. Are there other things that someone listening to this who's interested but isn't necessarily in a decision making position for these kinds of issues? Is there things that they can do, little things?
I mean, I guess there's usual things like advocating with your local governments, or I mean, I don't see a lot happening probably at the federal level anytime soon, but I do see that there are some at the state and local level. There have been some policy had been some policy movement to support some of the methods that are used in regenerative, like cover crops, for instance. I didn't even talk about cover crops really, but those are really essential, and they're kind of the counterpoint to what I said earlier about you don't want to leave ground bare for several months, which cover crops are the antidote to that in a way. You're saying no, we're not going to have that 3 months be bare ground. We're going to put this other crop in. So things like that, there's a policy element to that. It can be supported. I mean, you can right now basically the policy world supports what I would call bad agriculture, chemical agriculture, and if we shift some of that support to regenerative, it will speed the movement. I don't think a regenerative farmer doesn't necessarily need that support, because once they get into the biological style of agriculture, they'll be saving a lot of money because they won't have all those inputs. Just as for instance, there's a farmer in Indiana, Rick Clark, who he says he's saving, by his reckoning, he's saving about $2 million a year on inputs. He has about 7,000 acres, so he's got a big farm, but that's a whole lot of money. And he's saving it by doing things like cover crops. He also has these mixes. He can have as many as I think as much as 8 crops growing at one time in a field. So he really understands the diversity, the benefits of diversity in his operation. And so I think he's kind of a model. And he consults with farmers. He has a consulting thing he does, and that kind of peer to peer stuff is really important. I know you're asking about other people and what they should do, but I guess it's just get educated about it. I think getting educated is a good starting point, and then you can educate other people. You'll know when you see things in the store, you'll know what you're looking for. Or the other thing is to get to know farmers in your local area. Find out who's doing regenerative farming in your area, and you can support them if they are at your farmers market, or in whatever way you can support them.
Yeah, that makes sense. One thing we didn't even get into, but I have heard that eating regenerative food has nutritional benefits as well. I've been seeing that label come up more and more in the grocery store. So
Yeah. Well, I mentioned how the microbes get the minerals, right? I mean, the minerals don't end up in our food if they don't end up in the crop, right? And without the microbes, without that healthy microbiome, you don't get all those minerals. In fact, it's been chronicled that the level of minerals in our food has gone down for decades, and it's because of the way we farm. And so we have to change that if we want to have better, not just better crop outcomes, but better health outcomes for people. So.
yeah, awesome. Well, I'll link in this video your video, Growing Solutions. I'll link your book, the audiobook. I meant to compliment too, your audiobook was awesome. The
Oh,
the book is really cool, but the delivery of it was separately awesome. So
Thank you. I
yeah,
appreciate it.
yeah, good work on that. And then yeah, thanks for coming on. This was really cool. It helps me understand some of these dynamics that are um, out of my typical scope.
That's great. Yeah, this was great fun, Jake. And again, thanks for having me. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you, Leo.
All right. Take care, Jake.